When we last left the Dunbar, she was making her way up the New South Wales coast from the Roaring Forties with the intention to make her turn into the harbour on the evening of the 20th of August 1857. But just to recap, the Dunbar, a large sailing ship with a crew of 59 and 63 passengers aboard under the command of Captain James Green, left Plymouth in England 81 days earlier and made a lightning-fast passage around the world. For what comes next, we really are missing a lot of key details that will forever sadly be lost to time. But what we do know largely comes from the first-hand account of Dunbar survivor James Johnson, and those who went to the rescue of the vessel when disaster struck. On the 17th of August, the Dunbar passed the Cape Howe Lighthouse, which marked the southeast corner of the continent of Australia. The ship then turned north for the final short leg towards Sydney. The weather was not exactly clear, which is not uncommon at this time of year in the Tasman Sea, but it was, according to accounts, not at all to be considered threatening. By late morning, on Thursday the 20th, the Dunbar was less than 12 hours from making port in Sydney. Captain Green, after 2 days with nearly no rest at the helm while the ship made its way through a relatively dangerous part of the voyage, took the time to now say goodbye to all of his passengers one by one. As the afternoon carried on, the clipper passed the town of Wollongong, some 90 kilometres to the south of their destination. Like with every other day on the voyage, dinner was now called. The people aboard, the railway station store owner from Queanbeyan and the homestead owner from Tuggeranong, and the young families aboard, all sat down for their meals, excited to have some breakfast tomorrow on dry land for the first time in months. The crew on deck, meanwhile, as night fell, still had a job to do, and at 7:30 p.m. the weather suddenly turned, lashing the Dunbar with torrential rain, swells, and extreme wind gusts. Captain Green gave the order to bring in some sail, to give the helmsman more control over the ship, but slowing her speed and progress. By 8:30 p.m, Captain Green put the ship's location at about 18 kilometres out to sea from Botany Bay, and around 20 kilometres from the Macquarie Light, which could be seen blinking in the distance through the sheeting rain. The lighthouse was vital in getting the ship into port, because the entrance to the harbour was only 2.2 kilometres to its north. While the Dunbar battled on, Henry Packer, the signal master at Southhead Station, kept an eye out for any ships. The Dunbar, her sister Duncan Dunbar, Anne and Jane, the vocalist, and Zemindar were all due. While looking south, Packer would later state that he saw a single light, briefly in the heavy seas, before it disappeared. This was either the Dunbar or a small brig travelling down the coast. The brig made its way into the harbour, but shortly after, as the weather got worse, another small coastal steamer, the Grafton, stuck in the waves, was forced to turn around and get away from the heads, deeming it too dangerous. As time passed, the Dunbar found itself in even worse conditions, the wind increasing to at least 85 kilometres an hour, waves crashing over the ship, and the rain pouring down even harder. But the Dunbar ploughed on. Further north, as the clock struck 10, the wind picked up even further, blasting the ship with winds of over 100 kilometres an hour and throwing waves up over 10 metres. Captain Green ordered all of his crew to the deck. He needed absolutely every man for what came next. Standing on the deck next to the first officer Struthers and a sailor from Drogheda, James Johnson, he took stock of the situation. Green had two choices here: make for the harbour or sail with the wind to ride out the storm. The instructions for mariners sailing to Sydney at the time recommended the latter in these situations due to the danger of rocks, and Green was known to be a cautious captain who always put safety first. So that begs the question, why did he make the choice to enter the harbour? We will never know why Captain Green made the decisions he did that night, only that he gave the order to make for the harbour. Perhaps he feared that the storm would continue to worsen, and that the Dunbar would be wrecked at sea. It's possible, given how bad the storm had picked up in only 2 hours, but that's just pure speculation. The truth is, and forever will, as I've said, be lost to history. At about 11 p.m, with the Dunbar around 1.8 kilometres from Ben Buckler Headland at the north end of Bondi Bay, Green turned the ship towards the coast on a heading of 034, until the ship was about 6 kilometres from the Macquarie Light and level with the flashing signal. This course, Green surmised, would send the Dunbar through the headland and into the harbour in about 30 minutes, delivering the ship almost instantaneously into calmer waters once she passed the heads. It was here that Captain Green miscalculated, because even though the ship was pushing forward at 6 knots in the swell, she was being pushed back by a current of at least 3 knots. The weather had closed in further, and the Dunbar was now sailing completely blind only by dead reckoning with her sails reefed. The wind again picked up, slamming into the ship's side and pushing her even further off course, and it was here that the crew lost sight of the lighthouse, only capturing intermittent glimpses. 30 minutes had now passed since the ship had been set on its course, and Captain Green expected the ship to be between the headlands at this very moment. He ordered Second Officer John Spence and Third Officer John Pascoe to the bow, and shouted at them to report if they saw the north head. The men cried back in return, "Broken water ahead, breakers ahead." Green initially didn't react badly. He surmised that the ship was too near to the north of the harbour entrance, and he gave the order to go hard to port, likely thinking that this turn would land the ship safely into Sydney Harbour, towards Sydney Town. It would be a close shave, sure, but the ship would arrive safe and on time. The time was now close to midnight, and it was only now that the clouds and rain finally lessened, just enough to allow the beam of Macquarie light to pierce through the squall, and it was at this horrific moment that the captain realised he was 2 kilometres south of where he thought he was, sailing straight towards the gap, a sheer cliff face of 60 metres tall. The Dunbar was out of time. There was absolutely nothing that Captain Green could do at this point, but he tried anyway. He gave the order to square away and port the helm, trying to run south along the coast and get back out to sea. In normal circumstances, this might have well worked, but the swell picked up again, picking up the ship entirely and throwing her broadside right onto the Sawtooth rocks, like a hand picking up a stone and throwing it. The Dunbar was finished in seconds. After 81 days at sea, all 122 people aboard were now being crushed by the swell in their home-turned prison just 11 kilometres away from Sydney. Jane Graham, the wife of the signal station attendant James, woke up in a cold sweat that night and turned to her husband telling him a ship was on the rocks. Her husband, thinking she was just having a nightmare, tried to calm her down and send her back to bed, but she raised her voice and said, "For God's sake, Jim, there's a poor fellow lying on the rocks, help him." James wasn't really paying much attention to this though, putting it down to dreams that his wife was having, and he went back to bed. Not satisfied, Jane woke up Henry Packer, the assistant signalman, but he too, with James, managed to calm her down, and the three went back to bed. Meanwhile, at the Macquarie Lighthouse, the superintendent Joe Siddons heard his dog barking, and when he went outside, he saw the dog was at the cliff edge, running back and forward and making an absolute racket, tearing the bark off trees, ripping up grass, trying to get closer and closer down the hillside. Something was up, but nobody was really paying attention to these superstitious warnings, putting it all down to, well, superstition. The sad fact is that even if these people were paying attention and did put stock in the superstition, it would have meant nothing to the people stuck on the ship. After being thrown onto the rocks, completely on its side, the heavy swell battered the Dunbar, and within 5 minutes her masts had been snapped like toothpicks, showering the deck with heavy spars and rigging, crushing all those below, just puncturing huge holes in the deck, which seawater rushed into, lashing the deck, throwing the lifeboats off the ship and onto the cliffs, useless as they were anyway. On her side, the groans of the wood must have been horrifying. Some passengers made their way to the deck, in their nightgowns or naked, having rushed from their cabins. For those that remained below, the precious seconds they spent getting dressed or trying to get loved ones up completely doomed them. The lights went out due to the surging water, and as the waves crashed down, the wooden cabins on the Dunbar were crushed like beer cans under a heavy boot. It would have been obvious that, even if there was a rescue party waiting, nobody was getting off. We do not know exactly what happened to every man aboard. We know that James Green stood at his post trying to initially salvage the situation. We know passengers howled and cried. We know that some prayed. But it was all over for most of them pretty soon, either drowned or crushed. Thrown against the rocks and beaten apart by waves, one by one, every single man, woman and child aboard perished, their screams completely unheard from the township just a few kilometres away. Or so it was initially thought. The next morning, 2 harbour pilots from Watson's Bay, an inlet inside the harbour, were strolling along the cliffs when by chance they stopped at a place known as the Gap, and looked down. In what must have been a horrifying scene that stuck with them for their entire lives, they saw below them dozens of bodies, naked, being thrown against the rocks, sucked back and then thrown back again, beaten beyond recognition. They were quickly joined by the 2 signalmen, and if Jane's dream story is to be believed, the 2 men must have felt sick to their very core. The men set about letting the town know that something terrible had happened, that a ship had been lost, and news quickly spread. By mid-morning, questions were being asked in Parliament, which happened to be in session that day. But the reality was that due to technological limitations of, well, the fact it's the 19th century, Nobody knew what ship it was, how many were aboard, and so thousands who had heard the news were left to wonder, many of them if it was their friends or loved ones aboard one of the half-dozen ships that were due. By late afternoon, wreckage of the name Dunbar had been found and the ship's identity was confirmed. It was assumed that all aboard were gone, and so the people of Sydney, many in shock, went about the grisly task of recovering the bodies floating into the harbour, a task that would take weeks, while those who didn't know what to do made their way to the rocks just to look at the horror. When dawn broke the next day on the 22nd, Sydney can be described as a city in communal mourning. Everyone from shopkeepers who lost colleagues, to the member of Monero who lost his wife aboard, grieved together. Never before had a ship so large and so strong gone down on their doorstep. But through all the sadness and grief, there would be a brief moment of hope. 33 hours after the ship's impact, a crowd had gathered above the wreck, with the Mayor of Sydney standing with them, and they spotted a body below. But unlike the others, mangled and destroyed, this one was seemingly okay. And then it moved. Somebody was alive. Those on top of the cliff deduced very quickly that they had to get him up fast, or he was not going to make it. But there was no way he could survive a climb, or rope after 33 hours exposed to the elements, and of course they didn't know if he was injured or not. There was also no way a boat was going to get in close to get him because, well, if you look at the clips on screen now, this is footage from the rocks, on a good day. Arni Thorlakis, an Icelandic immigrant to Sydney, stepped forward. An apprentice watchmaker and hobbyist climber, he jumped forward, took his coat and boots off, tied a rope around himself, and went to climb. It took him multiple attempts, and he had to, at times, leap and drop between waves to avoid being thrown against the sheer cliffs himself. But after an extreme effort, he found himself at the bottom, face to face with a wind-burnt, weak, black-haired man with a bushy beard. The climb down was over 60 metres, and as you can see, it looks near impossible to do. But somehow he made it, and he strapped the men into a bosun's chair, giving the order to the men above to haul away. 45 minutes later, after searching frantically for more survivors, which sadly there were none, both rescuer and survivor found themselves safely on the hills above the gap. After the crowd's cheers had died down, the black-haired man was asked who he was. In an incredibly thick Irish accent, he responded back, James Johnson, able seaman, Dunbar. He was then wrapped in blankets and given brandy and taken to the doctor. The loss of the Dunbar, in many ways, can be considered a watershed moment in Sydney's history. Before the ship went down, it was a city on the rise economically, socially and culturally, but after that she was traumatised for years. Sydney-siders no longer felt the confidence and closeness with the mother country. They were reminded of just how far they were away from help, and this feeling spread into the interior. With towns like Queanbeyan losing key members of their community, Sydney would be stuck with the Dunbar's memory for months to come. It seemed to be that no matter how many bodies they plucked out of the ocean or bits of wreckage, one would somehow find its way past the heads into the town and landing on the beaches. James Johnson, the only survivor of this tragedy, was hounded for answers by inquiries and journalists, and as soon as he could, he made his way north to the town of Newcastle, where he tried to live out a quiet life. That is until 1866, when in a cruel twist of fate, he became instrumental in rescuing the sole survivor of the steamer SS Karawar when she was wrecked. As for Johnson's rescuer, he was rewarded by the crowd who threw together the equivalent of 3 months' wages as a thank you. Today, the Dunbar is largely gone. The ship's corpse beaten to oblivion on the rocks, only token pieces remaining. In 1906, a carving was made into the stone, memorialising the location where the ship was thrown ashore. Her anchor today remains though, instilled as a permanent memorial along a walking trail near to where she struck. It too is now largely unknown to the thousands who walk by her every single day. If you are in Sydney though, you can make your way to the gap and see yourself where she struck, where Captain Green's empty grave sits a few metres away from where he died. Should you head into the city, you will find trinkets and part of the ship, protected and memorialised by the few historians in Sydney who have made it their mission to remember, or the graves of the passengers interned in Newtown in what is now an overgrown and largely forgotten tomb. The Dunbar remains the worst maritime disaster to ever befall Sydney, and one of the worst in Australian history. But due to the passing of time, the wars in between, and a dozen or so other factors, she is largely a mystery to the millions of people who now call Sydney home. I hope you have enjoyed the tale of the Dunbar, and thank you for stopping by. If you like this story, please comment, and if you would like me to cover more shipwrecks like the Dunbar, ones from this era that history has forgotten, please do let me know. And as always, remember, choose the lesser of Two Weevils.